Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special episode of the War Report. Now, I know what you all want to hear about, so I'm going to tease you. I'm going to do what we are obligated to do as, of course, people who talk about big subjects online do. We're going to put that at the end of the show, so you have to watch through all this stuff, or, of course, you could watch the playback and skip through. And, you know how that goes. But we're going to return to tradition and start by covering some news out of the Middle East and Syria. So, starting with Syria, it looks like the push into northwestern Syria, the push into opposition controlled territory, is going, again, it's going smoothly, but hitting a few setbacks, much less than you would have expected had they done this in 2019 or, say, even 2020. And with that being said, of course, you have the rebels returning fire. Of course, they are shelling back, but it does look like they haven't exactly halted the Syrian offensive, but they have slowed it. Now, of course, this would have been unimaginable, like I said, 3 years ago, because you would have had Turkey at least, and of course, veiled threats from America and NATO as a whole, just preventing this and providing supplies, or the White Helmets doing some, the White Helmets doing what they do. Let's just put it that way. And
Mhm.
with that being said, as we've seen since at least I would say mid 2020, especially since Trump has left office, in the Middle East, in the Levant in particular, there's been something of a backseat role. The last real major action in the Middle East by the United States, I mean, if depending on how you count Afghanistan, which I'd say is more so Central Asia, but in terms of the Levant, in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean region, with that being said, it was the strikes on Iranian backed groups in eastern Syria by Biden back in February. And again, it's been pretty quiet since, of course, you've had Biden negotiating with the Iranians at this point. But with all that being said, this has been able to proceed very smoothly, like much more than it would have been able to in years past. It looks like they are giving a last ditch effort, the opposition forces, and that's when they're busy not infighting with each other. And probably the biggest news out of northwestern Syria, out of Syria in general, is that Turkey has begun shelling Afrin and rockets have been launched at Afrin, and you are having reports of casualties out of there. Now, of course, that's not to ignore the skirmishes ongoing in northeastern Syria and along the Euphrates, of course, the pockets of ISIS that are left. That's also not to ignore the machinations of the Kurds in northeastern Syria, but yet again, not much significant has come out of that so far. It's more so developing stories with, of course, uh, the Kurds are on alert because of Turkey's actions in Afrin. They do, of course, have their one checkpoint set up on the border with Iraq that has been assaulted by, again, presumably ISIS. Again, it's one of those things that they don't report. So the usual activity along the Euphrates and in northeastern Syria, with a marked escalation towards Afrin, with the Turkish forces attacking the. I suppose in Afrin they still identify as the YPG, but again, they're all extensions of the same group, which is mostly the PKK. Of course, for convenience sake and for the sake of international reputation, it's all the Syrian Democratic Forces, which again is mostly Kurdish, ruling over a majority population of Syrian Arabs. Again, you can see this yellow territory on the map right here. About 90% of that is occupied by Syrian Arabs. The Kurdish population of that, it does not, certainly not make the majority. It's just that they're the ones in charge of governing it. And that's as well as other minorities such as Yazidis, Assyrians, some of these more, I suppose you say ancient people, some of these more pre-Arab invasion, pre-Arab migration people. Point being is just covering all the ground. The Kurds, of course, continuing their tenuous grip on northeastern Syria, which does grow more tenuous by the day. And it, especially with the recent actions of Turkey, it looks like they have ceased with their operations with their safe zone. Of course, you'll remember what was it, Operation Peace Spring back in 2019, where they invaded that chunk you can
The
see on the
names are
map.
horrendous.
Oh, I mean, it's horrible. Like, I'm not saying by any means non-Western powers have good military operation names. Like I haven't heard anything impressive out of for example, Russia or China, but it seems like NATO just have the absolute worst military operation names when it comes to it, and for whatever reason, I don't know why. I mean, just horrible names for operations in general. Like, for example, the whole you know what project started under Trump as Operation Warp Speed. It's like, what the hell is that supposed to mean? I mean, we know exactly what it's supposed to mean, but it's like, come on, could you be less on the nose with it? Or again, you get things like Operation Peace Spring. But I'm getting off on way too much of a tangent here. But again, the biggest news is that it looks like, from my analysis, and you guys may or may not agree with me here, that Turkey is tying up what loose ends it can in northwestern Syria before it inevitably falls under government control. Because at this rate, barring some massive Black Swan event, I see no way, and I don't think most people see a way in which the opposition forces can reassert a foothold. I mean, number one, that would require them to stop the infighting that's been going on for years now. Number two, that would require a lot more funding and supplies than they currently have on hand. And the question is, would they be able to get it on time? Of course, it would require a consensus between Turkey, the United States, probably the UK, and other various NATO participants in order to again get this operation going. But we are just looking at the death throes of Idlib, and I'm going to keep hammering it at my own peril. I did have somebody threaten to unsubscribe if my prediction doesn't come true, but the last summer of Idlib is what we're talking about here, and you know, so if this isn't taken care of by June 2022, I guess we're down a subscriber or two. In which case, I'm glad you guys enjoyed. But it's fair enough. I've really been hammering this thing for about pretty much this entire year now. I think has been the one consistent thing I've been predicting is, the last summer of Idlib will be 2021. And like I said, if I had to speculate on Turkish operations currently with their shelling recently, it's cleaning up whatever they can while they can.
Yes, Syria has, I mean, it's hasn't been stable in over a decade, but it's been more stable than some of the other months this year. No, thank goodness, no surprise ISIS attacks in the middle of the Deir ez-Zor desert where, 14, 13, 15, whatever amount of Syrian soldiers are cut down, and, you see photos of a bus that's been charred, and you can only imagine what kind of hell the soldiers went through. So we're not seeing that. We're seeing some Israeli strikes, but no one has been killed. There were some minor injuries. Well over half the missiles were intercepted. The Syrian Air Force now has begun training for over a week, flying MiG-29s. I don't know if there's any SUs that they're going to be getting, but whatever one might say about the MiG-29, it's a very agile aircraft. It's very versatile, and it's generations ahead of what they had, which were MiGs basically from the mid 60s. So that's great. And as you say, there's that incremental slow push and squeeze on Idlib. Um, Generally speaking, things are pretty good. They're going on track. No new flare-ups in the south, in Damascus, or outside of Damascus, although that was kind of the area where Israel struck. But in a bit of news, Gantz's cleaning man has been accused of espionage. He has apparently given away secrets to uh, Iranian agents. That's going to be an interesting one to follow, and we'll probably hear something more. There, we haven't really heard more than that next week. Uh, I'm sure more information are good for are going well in Syria. Um, The rebels are still disunited, which is good news. America seems very preoccupied with Russia concerning Ukraine and Belarus, and probably Taiwan as well. And it's limited the amount of time they can devote to Syria. I suppose the long range view would be, what is Erdogan going to do with regards to Syria? Because I think in many ways he's more pivotal now than the Gulf states are.
Oh,
Some
almost
of the Gulf
certainly. And that
states, which were
that shift in power in the Middle East, especially when it comes to Syria, has been a long time coming. And I think with some of this news we'll get into about Yemen, even though it might look bad for the Houthis, it shows the declining relevance of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the other Gulf states. But do continue, because I think you're on the precipice of a
right,
point I was going to make here.
right. So I mean, I would say that, back in the 90s, when they wanted to complete that BTU pipeline from Baku towards Syria, vis-a-vis, sorry, towards Turkey, vis-a-vis Tbilisi. Um, at that time, Turkey was on board. Um, the the casinos, the kind of corruption that existed in uh, in Azerbaijan. It's also around the time that, just before the time that Aliyev came to power. There was some funding from the casinos in Baku for the Chechens in Russia. So the U.S. was destabilizing Russia in the 90s, during the time right after the collapse. And I guess getting prepped, getting ready for Afghanistan. Things didn't turn out that way. And then I think, this is why I think Erdogan is like such a big surprise, and why it is that the US wanted to get rid of him under Obama. Um, and that is, even though Erdogan supports Azerbaijan, the pipeline is still a no-go. And as reported, in the summer, that pipeline actually went east, towards China, instead of west towards Europe, right? And of course, Russia intervened with Turk Stream, what was formerly called South Stream. So that didn't go to plan, and that guy Gulen, who left in the 90s, um, of course, he was the guy with all the madrasas in Pakistan and other areas. He kind of played between this role of being a moderate, but he also had funding for fundamentalist schools.
Yeah, and hiding out in the
In a
mountains of
way, he was
Pennsylvania during all of this, it's amazing.
that's right, that's right, that's right. So he treaded that line, that pragmatism, where these extremely conservative organizations were used for geopolitical ends. And meanwhile, I mean, he wasn't really this religious conservative guy. Not that I have any kind of Epstein Island, Pedo Island information or something like that. It's nothing like that. But I'm just saying he wasn't really who he was, and whether you're criticizing him from the left or the right, he's neither of those things. It's just pragmatism. In the same way that, just because Brzezinski supported jihadists, that didn't mean he was a radical traditional Catholic, or that he was secretly a Muslim jihadist. Like, you know what I'm saying? I guess, I mean, I'm belaboring the point. Anyhow, what I wanted to say was, something has happened that Erdogan fully understands that that's not going to happen, right? But he wants his cake. He wants something. He wants his slice in this conflict, and he is willing to back um, Azerbaijan. I think mainly to deter Iran in Syria, but he's using it. He's using Azerbaijan as a proxy, because Azerbaijan, of course, shares a border with Iran, and of course, Iran does also with Armenia and so on, right? And it's an important trade route that is blocked right now to a degree. Um, so I guess for me, he's the pivotal guy. He can he can betray the Americans, and I think he must fully understand he fully understands that the Americans wanted to kill him in 2016, and he survived some way. And they can't they haven't had really the either the ingenuity or the guts, or the time is wrong, perhaps, that the Americans have not tried to assassinate him again. So it's up to him to work out a deal, I think, with Putin and with Assad to fix Syria. I think he wants probably something he can't be given, and I think that a lot of that is the Kurds on his border, and maybe that's why there's this plan to move the Syrian refugees who are of Arab descent into that region in order to water down the Kurdish population.
And of course, this is all on
Which
top
which
of.
is some of it is newly arrived. I mean, since the conflict, Kurds have gone into those areas and booted out Christian Arabs and Christian Muslims and Yazidis. So I suppose that's what I'm really interested in is why won't he make a move? What is the deal that he wants?
And this is also on top of that, he needs a pretty significantly symbolic domestic victory, something he can take home to the people and say, this is why we were in Syria, this is what we were doing the whole
Yes.
time. Because he's not unpopular by any means, but the Turkish economy is not doing well. And again, there is some internal pressure mounting against him. So he's really looking for something he can bring home to show that he's re-solidified his position, that he shows I'm a strong leader, I can exert our will, I can exert the will of the Turkish people and the Turkish nation upon Syria, upon whoever, and look, we got these material concessions out of it. And he needs something that at least is seemingly a material concession. Even if it isn't anything that great, something he can at least convince the general public that, hey, this was all worth it. And I think that's Erdogan's real dilemma right now.
Yes. Yeah.
And moving on from that, as you were saying, the Houthis did report that since June of this year, so about 5 months, 5.5 months, they have lost upwards of 15,000 fighters. Now, those are numbers we haven't seen in really any conflict zone in quite some time, really. Not even Syria
Uh-huh.
over the past several years. And with the brutal siege warfare that Yemen has undergone, when you consider a lot of it probably isn't active combat, but for example, just starvation, disease. Like, a few years ago, there were massive cholera outbreaks, which were affecting especially the civilian population. But the kind of siege warfare with low amounts of supplies and low amounts of support, it is conceivable that maybe it wasn't all combat deaths. Maybe not even again a
Mm.
majority of it was combat deaths. But again, I mean, there's still casualties of war, even if they are from these extenuating circumstances which were caused by the war. So one may think, even though the offensives have been pretty bloody in Yemen compared to, again, somewhere like Syria in recent years, it isn't inconceivable that they've lost that many. But something to also consider is they've lost 15,000 fighters since June over the past 5 months. And really looking at Saudi Arabia's conduct and the United Arab Emirates' conduct and the United States' conduct, you could say, despite all of that, they are still at the advantage in this conflict. They are still,
Yeah.
in a way, winning this war. And again,
Hmm.
I think this war is mostly a stalemate. I think it's similar to Libya in that situation where really neither side is going to budge anytime soon. But it looks like slowly but surely, for example, the Gulf states with the, and it has to do with the American backing, of course. And that's one thing that Biden actually surprised me on, pulling some of the backing for the Saudi war in Yemen, that this war is grinding to a halt. This war is coming to something of a stalemate. And of course, as I love to reference, you had a few months ago Mohammed bin Salman coming out and saying these Houthis are true warriors and their spirit has made them worthy to actually be called Arabs. Stuff like that, throwing a bone to
Yeah.
them, trying to have some sort of reconciliation. Of course, this is on top of Saudi Arabia's tepid reconciliation with Iran, somewhat led on by the American led negotiations, where these two are coming together. These two are trying to lead to a cessation in hostilities because of what I'd imagine are mostly external pressures. Because I don't imagine the House of Saud is eager to be brokering a deal with the Iranians anytime soon, at least of their own accord. So I would say one place that America is actually exerting its foreign policy influence, and in an inadvertent way, I kind of support and has actually turned out somewhat well, is with the Saudi war on Yemen. That it has really led to this backing down of tensions there, and I wouldn't even necessarily credit Biden for that. I don't know. Maybe Blinken may be considered smart enough to actually formulate a plan like that. But it does look like one good consequence of all of this that I was not expecting is that things, yes, are drawing down in Yemen despite the high casualty numbers. And again, in my estimation, I haven't seen any figures that would prove or disprove this. Please let me know if there is something because I
Hmm.
would like to learn more about it. It does seem like, in terms of like active combat, in terms of like people dying in means of conventional warfare, of course, you know shot, shelled, etc. I would guess it has to do with the more secondary causes, you call them, such as you know famine or disease. But either way, it still is shocking that you can look at
It
these
is. I mean,
casualty numbers.
It's 300 a month.
Oh yeah,
It's
yeah,
we're
3,000 a
talking.
month. Like,
Yeah. I mean, sorry. We're talking about 3,000 a month.
and
I
I'm
mean,
pretty sure
that's
that's not
like
even
what?
including civilian
That's 100 a
casualties.
day.
Yeah, like that's
Yeah.
um, which, like I said, it has to be because of one of those other factors. But point being is, it is shocking that simultaneously that has happened, yet they could still be viewed to be an advantage in this war. In which case, I would certainly say they are.
Yeah, they are. I mean, you can tell the flip side of the statistic is how resolved they are. They don't have an air force. They have taken over some of the suburbs of Marib already, so they're closer than at any time they've ever been, and they're getting pummeled with bombs. But they're still pressing on. It's really quite something. I mean, a lot of other nations who also have their populace starving to death and whatnot. This war has been going on for 6 years now, at least, and I think it started in 2014. With all that, a lot of nations would have seceded at this point. They would not have continued fighting. They would have sued for some kind of peace. But yeah, quite remarkable.
Oh, certainly. And with all that being said, I suppose we can move into some brief Caucasian news. I think that's a
Yeah.
good, quite literal bridge between the Middle East and Europe. Is that tensions
Hmm.
are once again flaring up between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And these tensions actually really started to take root on the anniversary of the tenuous peace agreement, which was November 9th. Now, November 9th of 2020 is when you had the Russian brokered peace agreement between the two sides that was less advantageous to Armenia, but at that point, they didn't have the bargaining power in order to make it a stalemate or even a favorable outcome. The Azeris did, of course, with Turkish and Israeli and other outside support, did best the Armenians in that war. And I don't say that as somebody who's sympathetic to the Azeri cause. My sympathies lie much more with the Armenians and their claims to Nagorno Karabakh. But with that being said, they didn't handily lose the war, but it did not go well for them by any means. Now, maybe in the beginning you had that, but as time went on, it favored Azerbaijan, which I think is the case in general, just with the dynamic between the two. If there's going to be an Armenian victory, it has to be swift. It has to be something they can move in and secure. Time is not on their side, in which case they would need outside support, whether that be Russia, whether that be based Macron coming in and providing French support for Armenia because there's some outgrowth of European or Christian civilization or blah 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 or whatever justification they would give. Of course, he gave this great symbolic gesture to them, which ultimately resulted in nothing last time. But conflict has picked up again in Nagorno Karabakh, with Azerbaijan, of course, saying, "Well, you know what? We did pretty well last time. Let's stop us from pushing a little further." And of course, this is on top of months of tensions, particularly between Azerbaijan and Iran, where it's been they've been almost coming to blows. They haven't quite yet, but it seems you could describe this almost as a proxy conflict between Iran and Azerbaijan via Armenia. And it's created this strange bedfellow situation where if you were to think about civilization, culture, religious ties, that Iranians and even with diaspora populations would be more sympathetic, would have more in common with the Azeri cause. But it turns out Azerbaijan views itself more as a Turkic nation than it does a Shia Muslim nation. While they may still be the religious majority, the population is very secularized. It's very cultural aspect rather than a genuine religious aspect. Now,
Hmm.
I'm not saying the Iranians are the most devout Muslims in the world, not by any means, but their Islam, their Shia Islam in particular, is much more of a genuine belief than the cultural institution it is in Azerbaijan, where it's again most
It's a
Azeris,
civic
yeah,
religion.
it's a civic religion. Most Azeris do not live what one would think of as a traditionally Muslim lifestyle, and with that, you have Iran, which is a self-declared Islamic republic, supporting what a nation that prides itself on being the oldest Christian nation in the world against another nominally Muslim country that's more secular and more Turkic in its ideas. Again, this is just covering grounds for people who may not have had too much knowledge of the prior conflict before I get into some of the stuff about what's actually going on now. And again, it's been putting it in this weird position where, and I'm sure, of course, with Russia, Iran is eager to stay on good terms with them. And I'm not saying that their relationship is at any risk of falling apart anytime soon, but there are some stumbling blocks in between it, and the warm relations between the two are a pretty recent thing. Since one could say the Iraq War, but really since the 2010s is when they really started to solidify their diplomatic relations as friendly countries, so to speak. And
Hmm.
again, I imagine of course, they do find common cause there, but it creates again this spider web, and I'll let you get some of the details that have come out now, where you have Russia and Iran supporting Armenia, Turkey, and even Israel backing the Azeris, and of course with the West. It's always this contentious relationship with Turkey. Like, sometimes we support what they do as an agent of chaos, sometimes we oppose it. This just so happens to be one of the times where they don't outright support it, but they tolerate it from Turkey. They say you can have it, you can have this conflict, you can cause trouble on the Russian and the Iranian backyard. You can mess with this country that, again, practically borders both of them. In the case of Azerbaijan, quite literally, whereas Armenia, again, there is the separation of Georgia, which it's not like Georgia is anti-Western by any means. Don't get me wrong, but again, it creates this situation where they don't have to actively support it, but Turkey can sow these seeds of discord in the Caucasus, again, right in both Iran and Russia's backyard, which is very advantageous for the usual suspects, for the people in
Hmm.
Washington, for the people in Brussels, for the people in London, Paris, etc., etc. And as we said last year, this would be a temporary piece. This would not last.
Yeah.
Eventually, it would collapse under its own weight. And I have to say, I thought it would have happened sooner. I'm surprised it made it a year. Now, it
Mm.
was like, I think it was actually just shy of a year it made it because of the way that hostilities took place. But again, it made it, for all intents and purposes, about a year before crumbling under its own weight, which I'm rather impressed with the fact that it could do that in the first place. And again, I obviously am biased. I put that out there. But this does seem to be an Azeri initiated conflict. It doesn't look like the Armenians. Honestly, it looks like in Armenia, with the internal political situation there, which we have covered over the past few months, they're still licking their wounds from this war. They've still not recovered, at least in a psychological sense. Their nation still has not completely processed this defeat. And now it's being thrust into much the same conflict. And that's on top of course, its main supporters, which again would be Russia or Iran, are both involved in other, you could say, more important theaters. For example, Russia with the situations in Belarus and Ukraine, and Iran with the situation with the broader Middle East and, of course, its relationship to America, these negotiations of new terms, its relationship with the Gulf states, etc. So it's really a second priority of both these countries that are its main sponsors, which does put it in a less advantageous position, but it also brings into consideration Turkey could very well make this a higher priority if they push the envelope too far. Because if it's just the right amount of chaos zone, it can be overlooked. It can be dealt with on a secondary matter. It can be dealt with later. But if Erdogan, which I wouldn't put it past him, pushes luck ever so slightly, all of a sudden you have to worry about this Turkish proxy state right on your border. Not that Azerbaijan isn't already, but this overt Turkish proxy state on your border. Whereas again, Russia and Iran both maintain decent diplomatic relations with Azerbaijan. Again, it's a very contentious situation where it could very easily become a prime focus of one or two of them if the pieces fall in the right place.
Right. And this goes back to Turkey's ambitions as well in that region. Erdogan, like Gulen, both um, they both subscribe to not the implementation of a grand Turkic superstate. That's not what I'm suggesting, but they do want more cohesion with the Turkic people of Central Asia, and including parts of Siberia that have like the Sakha and the Yakut that are Turkic speaking essentially. Um, so Gulen and Erdogan, Gulen was the first to push this idea, and you can tell that in the propaganda pieces by both countries, but particularly Azerbaijan, they do push this, right? And for good reason on a pragmatic level, because that region, especially in the 90s, was and in the early 2000s, like in my time, uh, I thought, according to what I was reading at the time, they were literally saying things like, "This is going to replace Saudi Arabia." So that's that's the kind of language that you read in respected mainstream media news sources like the Washington Post, the London Times, and so on. Um, but I think this is part of Erdogan's ambition as well. But he has to play it careful, and so does Aliyev, because ultimately, look, the big deciding factor is still going to be Russia. It won't be them. In many ways, Russia, I think, probably secretly always wanted to patrol that area, and it got what it wanted. Uh, it punished Pashinyan, and Russia got its bases there that it wanted. It has kept, to a degree, it has kept the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh and um, the Azerbaijanis at bay. Part of Azerbaijan is still this island unto itself, separated from the rest of Azerbaijan, and that kind of tells you like which side probably uh, instigated this latest outburst. Now, both sides have had at least 6 to a dozen, or a little bit more than a dozen casualties. I read at one post where Azerbaijan claimed it lost something like 12 or 13 men, and the Armenians today admitted to like 6 or 7.
And actually, Armenia's parliament is up to admitting up to 15 were killed in clashes.
Oh, okay, okay, so that's new. Okay, so both are around the dozen or a little bit over a dozen mark. Surprisingly, Azerbaijan admitted their losses first. But if you look at where the conflicts are, it's all on the east side of the board, that chunk of Armenia that stretches down into the Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's not on the west side. That is part of that isolated chunk, that little chunk of Azerbaijan. So I'm guessing that chunk doesn't have a lot of military power. So powers from the east would have to roll over that southern part of Armenia to link up with that segregated island of territory. In any case, it all depends on what is it that Turkey wants, because I think Turkey probably has now more free reign than it's ever had before. And a win would be for it would have to be economic for sure, but it can't be entirely, because I think even though Turkey kind of represents the last phase and the death of the Islamic civilization, they are still its last representative. And I think, you know, the need to uh like, how can I put it? They're still more of a warrior than a merchant. And
They
as
haven't quite
you
been
alluded
pacified
earlier,
yet.
hmm yeah, as you alluded earlier, they need a win that signifies that, not just like, stable living conditions that makes, I don't know, the angry feminists in Istanbul happy. Like, it'll have to take more than that.
Yes, and you'll have to remember with Erdogan's internal political strategy, part of his conservative backlash in Turkey, so to speak, because Turkey's always been billed as this liberal and progressive and modern Islamic country, showing that Muslim countries can really be republics and can really be democracies. Not a defense for republicans or democracies, by the way, but his strategy has been to move these more conservative, more rural people into the cities and incentivize them to come into the cities
Hmm.
and again
Hmm.
fight something of a culture war there on behalf of him. You'll recall during the attempted
Yep.
coup, it was when they landed in the city now known as Istanbul, where you had crowds of his supporters on the streets. And again, these weren't the kind of people that were billed, 20, 30 years ago as, again, these modern progressives and liberals. It was these people who were imported into the cities in order to, again, change the political state and the culture of the country. So
Hmm.
it's those people he has to satisfy. And of course, those people are much more nationalistic and jingoistic and, of course, much more religious as well. And that's where they're looking for that victory. But with all that being said,
Yeah.
moving on to more proper European news, it does look like Belarus has changed up strategies a bit. They had their fun with the migrant game, and of course, the European Union did as well because Germany actually capitulated and sent their buses to go pick up these migrants from Belarus, drive them through Poland, and take them to Germany, of course, as is the natural logical thing to do, of course, just bypass Poland and appease the Poles by taking just the migrants to there. The Belarusian authorities are now overseeing the return of these, particularly Iraqi refugees, back to Baghdad and overseeing flights from Minsk to Baghdad in order to take those people back to the Middle East and back to their home countries and back to their region. Which you do have to think there's a little bit of humor in this situation. You do have to admit
Yeah,
that,
there is.
because going back to Erdogan, he's kept up this constant pressure where he keeps them in his country, and it's like, any minute now I could send them over. But it seems like as soon as Lukashenko got the concessions they wanted, he said, "Yeah, you've served your purpose. Now get out of here, or go home," which you do have to appreciate a bit. And it does look like he's
Yeah.
moved on to stage two of this cold conflict, where he is now threatening energy supplies to both Poland and, I would say more importantly in this case, Ukraine, because Ukraine is also trying to weave this narrative that there's this massive buildup of Russian troops on the border, that they fear an impending attack, that they fear more chaos in the Donbass or Crimea or whatever. And of course, there's not really that much of a buildup. It's been very oversold to both the Ukrainian public and to the Western public as a whole. And this has been seemed to have been the focus of at least American diplomatic attention and European diplomatic attention. The fact of this alleged buildup. Now, it does show how much of a flash in the pan the whole migrant crisis with Belarus was, because Last week that was all the rage. That last week that's all the Europeans were talking about. But now all of a sudden that issue has been more or less resolved. That the migrants are returning back to the Middle East and back to Iraq and back to what are essentially their homes. It looks like the threat of Russia on the Ukrainian border, which they have been hyping for the past several weeks now, is finally coming to fruition, and it's something we need to focus on, and it's something that we need to issue these diplomatic statements on. And again, it seems like, and I suppose you could say this about every geopolitical situation, but the situation with Russia and its backyard, which one could say is Belarus and Ukraine, has been a bit of a broken record since the color revolution in Belarus last summer. So for about the past year and some change, it seems like we've just been repeating the same cycles over and over. Russia and Belarus are moving closer to unification. Russia and Ukraine are at each other's throats. They are, again, they're staring each other down. They're on the brink of a war. Blah blah blah. Poland is trying to garner more security for itself and garner more patronage from the West in order to increase its own border security, increase its own military, etc. France and Germany have been doing this thing where they flip flop, whether we're more conciliatory towards Russia one day and then we're on our toes the next day and talking about how they must be put in their place and how we can't tolerate this sort of action and aggression. All while, barring a few statements here and there, the United States has been conspicuously quiet on the whole thing, which isn't a surprise with absentee president in office who, of course, did undergo his routine colon surgery, which led to Kamala, for a brief window, becoming the acting president. Now, one could say that might be a dry run for something else. Now, I would never suggest such a thing. And with all that being said, you have this very strange dynamic where the coalition of European nations, the European Union, if you will, Brussels, I suppose we could say, again, and you could say it's also most manifested in France, especially Germany. They have this very one foot in, one foot out policy towards Russia, where they realize they can't isolate them, even though Germany will do things like suspend cooperation on Nord Stream, which we'll get into a couple minutes here, but also not completely cancel it, not completely put the axe to it. And again, you have Macron's very on and off statements where I don't think there's an exact consensus in the European Union. I don't think this is an original take by far, so if I say it that way, I don't mean to. I don't think there's a real solid consensus on policy towards Russia within the nations of the European Union, particularly France and Germany.
Yeah, I don't think so either. It's not clear cut because they're beholden to them to some extent. So I'll give that to Polish nationalists. um, but I mean, all kidding aside, Lukashenko did get what he wanted. So he got Merkel's foreign minister to speak to his foreign minister, and he got Merkel to speak to him directly. Um, in some ways, maybe this is very personal, and he does want to be recognized. Like, you can't say that I'm not the leader of this country, right? And also, he's probably thinking like, I opened up an American embassy for you people. I made a gas and oil deal with the Americans, and like, this is the thanks I get. So it is payback, but it's payback that's much more in depth that I'm describing than, oh, he did this just because of sanctions. I mean, they're only saying that because they want you to believe that sanctions are effective. Um, Not that he, let's say, felt betrayed, or that ultimately discovering that the West and America are just going to play with you is is a losing battle. So I think it has more to do with his naivete than it has to do with like and his ego being wounded rather than some that it's just the sanctions. I don't believe that. Also, he rejected the IMF offer and for a COVID shutdown. Uh, and of course they retaliated. But what is he? I mean, what was it? Something like 960 some odd million US dollars. I mean, it's not even a billion.
Yeah, it was just shy
It's
of a
close,
billion.
but it's just shy of 1 billion. I mean, what is he really going to do with that? If he did a shutdown in Belarus, I think he would have destroyed his economy, and I think that's what they were counting on, right? I mean, it's not like I don't know. It's not like Belarus can shut down their society for a year and a half, like let's say Norway or Denmark can, and he'll just come out of it as if very with minor impacts.
And
He
you
can't.
saw this throughout comparable nations. For example, when Serbia tried their lockdown, it was met with massive protest. Romania has had very lax restrictions on this whole lockdown nonsense. And Bulgaria has also been another country with very little to no restrictions, where it's these countries that really it's not economically feasible to shut down for several months out of the year,
Yes.
multiple times a year, or whatever. And of course, Belarus being solidly outside the sphere of the West, whereas the Balkan states, again, such as Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, of course, two of those are NATO members, two of those are EU members. Serbia is, of course, toying with the idea as they have been for about a decade or so now. It it's been something they resist. I think again, even getting somewhere like Croatia, they have. But these, what would have once been called second world countries, I suppose it may be a bit of an outdated term, but for sake of convenience, these second world countries realize that we simply cannot do these lockdowns. You could say even Russia is included in that, despite their recent moves to try to implement some sort of QR mandate when it comes to public transportation. Even though, again, it's a very wishy-washy policy, which is like, well, the federal government is going to mandate it, but the local republics they're responsible for implementing it. Blah blah blah. The oblasts it's their responsibility. Where it's again very one foot in, one foot out sort of thing. But it's these countries that don't have these I would say nearly endless economic engines you think of, like with some of these Western countries, like the U.S., Canada, U.K., Scandinavian countries. I mean, you even saw this in France and Italy, which were rocked especially hard by 2008 and the economic crisis there, where there it does seem to be significantly more pushback. Where it seems like again, the less materially prosperous the nation, I think this goes without saying, the more damaging lockdowns were. And you could argue, and I certainly would, that was part of it. It was to destabilize some of these second rate nations, some of these nations that were not on par with the West, not on par with, again, the Anglosphere, I'd say in particular, but were just there just enough to keep them on their toes. And for example, like France, like Italy, and you even want to get into some of the Eastern European
Hmm.
examples.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think Poland was also pretty resistant on all this stuff. But yeah, what I'm ultimately getting at, and just to prove your point, it was something that was more resistant by these poorer nations, Belarus being one of them, but Belarus being outside of the sphere of the West and not having the sort of influence that Russia does, got hit particularly the hardest when it came to punishment. They were the one that were chosen to make an example out of. If you don't want to go along with this, let's call it New World Order for sake of convenience, then this is what we'll do to you. This is how we will treat you. There will be sanctions. We will claim you're illegitimate. We will work to undermine your government. We will work with protesters in your country. We will work with all these NGOs in order to make your country a living hell if you don't comply with the living hell we want to impose on you.
Right, right. And I guess I mean I haven't looked too much. I mean, I've seen the headlines, and we're trying to squeeze in a lot tonight. But even Russia has implemented yet another lockdown. Now, the first two that they tried failed. They failed miserably. My friend Roman in St. Petersburg was laughing about it. Just basically telling me it's like, yeah, officially, but nobody takes it seriously. And my friend Irina in Moscow as well. Um, now this particular one is for older people to stay home. That's an idea that's been floated out there. But then in the far east, in around Vladivostok, I forget what region Vladivostok belongs to, but they have started introducing QR codes. But in the vast areas, they haven't. Now, I don't know how far they're going to go with this. I don't know how successful it's going to be, but it is extremely disappointing, if you ask me.
Yeah,
But
even
I
if it
just, I
isn't like what Austria and Germany are doing with of course, the lockdown for the people who have refused what. It's disappointing
Right.
to see it given lip service or credence by country, even if it just goes half-ass
Yes.
or just completely symbolic with it.
Right. And I think I think with the smaller countries, they're asking them to do this. So they have massive business failures in order for like countries like Germany, but probably France as well and Britain to vulturize them,
Oh, of course. I mean, that's
right?
been the formula with Eastern Europe since the fall of, the Soviet
Yeah, yeah.
Union, hasn't it?
I, I think in Russia it works differently. They have their elite vultures that want to take swallow those up. It won't be Western vultures, but it'll be their own vultures who will want to gobble up those businesses. Kind of like what happened in America.
Yeah, I
Like
mean, like
the
it sucks for small businesses, but just speaking personally, I think the vast majority of people would agree with the sentiment. It's better to be ruled by domestic oligarchs than foreign oligarchs.
Right, right. And then the latest data from the NHS today is really quite something. Extraordinary statistics. 60% of all people being admitted into hospitals for COVID are double vaxxed.
Well,
They're
I
also the
guess it's time for
majority.
triple. I
They're also the
guess.
majority of deaths now in hospitals. I was beside myself. I mean, I've heard statistics where it's close, you know, close, but not quite there. Yes, 82% of all COVID deaths are people who are vaccinated.
And
Is
with that note, I will say this before we move on to the top story of the night, because I know you people, or I suppose it'll be afternoon by the time you guys are watching this. I know everyone's dying to hear our takes on it. I'm sure we have
Yeah, yeah,
not much
yeah.
original, but we gotta. But with that being
We
said,
got it.
speaking of what mandates and everything like that, Biden's plan for OSHA to implement these on businesses with over 100 people it's been temporarily suspended. It looks like it's having challenges in the courts, which could signal, especially with some of the bad press, as you were saying. That's more so UK, but
Mhm.
again, even within the United States, there's been some
Excuse me.
less than favorable press when it comes to the what and their effectiveness and the side effects. And
Yeah.
it looks like, at least for the time being, they're putting this on hold. I'm sure it will come back to bite us later. I'm sure this will be something they bring back. But at the end of the day, I think it's also one of those things where it's something that they're going to constantly weigh over your heads. Like, we're not going to do it yet, but we could do it at any moment. So you better comply. You don't want to be left behind, do you? One of those sort of things. And I think
Right. I
that'll
mean,
probably be the model
yeah.
going
Go ahead.
forward, just to keep that as a boogeyman, to keep that as something that hanging over your head. I mean, I imagine they will try a pen to paper implementation of it sometime soon. I thought they were serious with this most recent one with the January 4th deadline, but it looks like they have capitulated on that as well, which I'm certainly not complaining about, don't get me wrong. But we certainly haven't seen the end of this. But it makes me both optimistic in the sense that resistance to this does seem to have some sort of effect, but it's also one of those things that they just want to keep holding over our head to the point where, to
Mhm.
borrow an overused term of this episode already, it seems like a bit of a stalemate in this regard.
Right, and we have to mention, Austria is has implemented another total lockdown, and in February they are mandating vaccinations, like it or not. You refuse, you go to jail 4 weeks, or you get a fine, or both, depending. I guess it's circumstantial, or maybe it's by region, but it'll be one of those two.
I know hypocrisy means nothing, and I know that, like, you said Austria. I know, like, Australia is doing pretty much the same thing, because Austria is having the lockdown for the people, again, who refused it, whereas Australia is doing the outright legal mandates. But it does make you wonder, okay, if this is about health, if this is about protection, why are they hurting all these people who are supposedly at this higher risk for this, worst pandemic since the Spanish flu, into crowded, you know, crowded corners with each other, putting them all in prison, so to speak. Isn't this by your definition just setting them up for the worst to happen if we're seriously to believe that
Yeah.
everything about this? So again, I don't think anyone watching this show needs to be reminded that it's never really been about public health or safety. It's always been
Yeah,
about
yeah.
cementing what is left of the empire and reasserting control. But again, it just makes it that much more blatant. And one could say I'm personally very thankful to the Australians, and my sympathies goes out to you if any of you are in this audience, for taking the fall for the rest of the Anglosphere to show what is to come. And again, I think that has led to I've seen from, of course, discussions within the both American mainstream and alternative medias about Australia in particular, like this saying this is to come if we just lay down and tolerate this. So I have to say I really appreciate you guys taking one for the team, so we don't have to. But I mean, and again, you have in the U.S. also, not to belabor the point, uh, some other very interesting developments. For example, the federal government has threatened to demote the Oklahoma National Guard to a militia if it doesn't implement mandates. Now, something to note about the Oklahoma National Guard: these aren't your weekend warriors. These aren't your stereotype of the National Guard. For example, the people you saw patrolling D.C. during the inauguration, these overweight middle-aged women. The Oklahoma National Guard, compared to other state National Guards up there with, again, states like Texas, etc., are actually pretty battle hardened. They saw some time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and somebody went over the amount of equipment they had. So they're pretty much what somebody described is they have the military that's the equivalent of a small European nation. So I'm not saying it would
Wow.
come to blows, but point being is the federal government is threatening to alienate something like that, and one could almost say that they're trying to bait states into taking some sort of drastic action. Now, I don't think it's going that far yet, but I
Hmm.
do think that they are sowing the seeds for that, whether intentionally or unintentionally. That they are going because as much as America may be an empire, just based on our own mythology, our federal structure about where the federal government is supposed to be the least powerful, and you're supposed to answer to your local and state government. The federal government is supposed to handle just like rudimentary stuff. That's the American mythology, at least, which again, plenty of people still buy into. Outright antagonizing state governments and state level institutions like National Guards, it does seem to be sowing the seeds for some discontent. And again, I'm not saying I expect Oklahoma to declare independence anytime soon, but in the coming decades, you're creating this resentment that may lead to something like that. By the 2040s, so to speak. Again, that's just a arbitrary timeline. I'm not making any real prediction, but point being is, it is embittering the subjects of the empire, not only just the plebeians, but people who actually have influence. For example, like a state level National Guard, like a governor, like a state legislature, etc.
Hmm. Right. And, maybe too, what you're saying that can bring in some definition on this prognostication that we are kind of implying, if things keep going this way, if the government, it does seem like it's goading them on to try to do something. Well, I mean, I saw a short interview, or what I saw, what was available to me on the internet was an interview with Jan Stoltenberg, and he said that the January the 6th protesters are actually an enemy of NATO.
Oh, I was just about to bring that up, but I saw that too, where it pretty
Is
much,
that
yeah, like,
wild? Like, I think, this reminds me of the libs when Trump got elected and they said, "Oh my God, Merkel is the last leader of the West," and she's a woman. So I think, I think this sound like you can tell what's happening, right? Like, the more lib elements of the American public who like the empire and see themselves within this greater context, NATO being one of these organizations of that context. They're like, they're basically saying, if things go really shitty here, and Alex Jones might be proven right again.
oh yeah, I was just about to bring that up. Like
Maybe
the
maybe it's
fringe,
not going to be UN troops, but
yeah,
it's going to be NATO troops.
yeah, I was about to say, like, this is a vindication of the fringe anti-establishment. I don't say any of those terms as derogatory, of course. Right-wing politics of the 1990s, and where again you had people like Alex Jones, you had some of these other figures saying, well, of course they're not going to get Americans to do this to their own populace. They're not going to get the American military, which is drawn from the American populace, to do this to their own. So they're going to bring in, of course, at the time it was the blue helmets that are going to do this. But and honestly, much more plausible with the way the organizations work. Like I'm not saying this is anytime soon, but yeah, NATO troops. Bring in some Dutchmen or some Danes or German forces. I mean, because at the end of the day, you look at the size of these European militaries; they're more just glorified police forces in most cases, especially with some of these smaller
Yeah.
nations. Again, like to the point where yeah, the Oklahoma National Guard probably has more firepower than a country like the Netherlands or Belgium. But with that being said, it does bring up this thing, and it also brings up the one of the most basics of managing an empire. If you want to put down a revolt, you have to use people who are alien to the revolt that you're putting down. And every empire, some of the elites or like the bodyguards of the palace were of some foreign extraction. And you could also see this with America's internal demographics, with, of course, the diversity and inclusion, the
Yeah.
importance placed on that. For example, using non-whites such as Hispanics, blacks, in order to use them as a wedge against the majority population. It does go back to this sort of thing. It is fodder for these people who have been saying this kind of stuff for the past 20, 30 years. And one could say they're doing it intentionally. I think to a degree they must be. But again, even if this doesn't lead to anything in the short term, they are most certainly, I think this applies to most imperial policies, sowing the seeds of resentment among the group that is supposed to be the core of the empire, the group that was, promised to rule the empire pretty much up until the late 90s. It was really, you could say from the end of World War II to the end of the Cold War, it was promised to the, you know, majority white Anglophone American population that, yeah, this empire exists
Hmm.
for our benefit. This is for you. Now, of course, none of that was true. The American empire has actually always been a net negative in terms of our business model has actually been sending wealth overseas to bribe colonies to be part of the empire rather than extracting wealth, which we would think is the natural formula of an empire. But what do I know? But again,
Right.
it's outright
I
saying
mean,
you're disinherited.
right. I mean, just as like Jan Stoltenberg, it's not a light statement, right? Like he's not going to get reprimanded for making this statement. He might get ignored. There are bigger issues going on, and of course, we're getting to like the big news of the day. But it's not a light thing for him to say, and he will not be reprimanded for this. In a way, it's a mask off moment if for a scenario where it would look like that America was, you know, going to enter a civil war. NATO definitely would go to help the empire faction of America. There's no that I mean, almost all civil wars have this external partner or partners that come in at one point or another for either side. So it's not a shock. It's just it kind of I'm kind of disappointed with myself, right? Because I never even thought of it. It didn't even occur to me. Like that was part of the shock is him saying something like this, and it made so much sense.
Well, to quote,
Of course, they would that would happen, given the case. I know he's trying to demonize it. I know it's a virtue signal. The libs in America, the internationalists. So this this warms the cockles of their heart and so on.
yeah,
But
it's back to that trope of, oh, the Europeans are so much better at being American than we are. That, of course, domestic
yeah,
and foreign liberals both love to do.
yeah, and you know who's actually also better at being Americans than Americans?
Oh, who's that?
Canadians.
Oh, yeah, of course. They are perhaps the gold standard when it comes to being better Americans than
Yes.
Americans themselves. Uh, it's this very
I'm gonna have to
subjugated.
take a shower after that.
You will multiple, but it is this very subjugated mindset in terms of Western nations, where again, even their anti-Americanism is predicated on America. But
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
just in regard to Stoltenberg's comments, I think to quote one Judge Schroeder, I wouldn't have expected it to be so brazen.
That's brilliant.
But yeah, moving into the big story of the night here, Kyle Rittenhouse, the king of Kenosha, has been acquitted on all charges. Now, back,
Kenosha Kid is free.
yeah, he is indeed. Now, back in the episode we previously did, I said I felt like he had a pretty good chance. It was something I was actually not pessimistic about, and that you weren't even pessimistic about. Think about that. Think
Hmm.
about that. I didn't say it was a shoo-in. I didn't say, oh, it's guaranteed that he'll get out. I was worried they'd at least get him on one thing or another, even if it's just a slap on the wrist, enough to give him a record. But he got off on all charges. In fact, I was certainly not slacking off at work watching the trial. No, not by any means. But when you had that, I was watching it live when they read the verdict, when the judge read the verdict, and of course, they have to keep you in suspense because everything's a reality show now, one at a time, going through all five of these charges. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And by the last not guilty, by the other one, the kid just collapsed. Just the amount of relief,
Yeah.
like he wasn't even able to stand. And I'm of course very satisfied with this outcome, and I think this and I mean, liberals in the media and on social media were seething. One Twitter post, I believe Evan Platinum was the guy's account name, if you want to check him out, said that liberals are posting on here like this is Gab. Like, I mean, these people were outright, they were Fed posting. They said X needs to happen. You had, like, these Antifa groups saying, oh, well, maybe we need to start doing X, Y, and Z if the right wingers are just going to commit acts of domestic terrorism against us. Like, just,
You already do.
yeah, it's like.
You literally already do.
Self-awareness check seems to be zero, which is to be expected. But it was, of course, from the media and from the usual suspects, exactly what you'd expect. Biden took a very weasel's answer, saying, "Oh, well, the jury made the decision. I trust the process." It's just, and this is, of course, the guy who a year ago was accusing him of being a white supremacist, but. Again, he found a good weasel out answer saying, "Oh, well, the courts made the decision, blah blah blah." Which, I mean, is to be expected of a president. That's a pretty canned response. Not really anything I have any strong feelings about. I'm just glad it wasn't, him like saying, "Oh, the justice system has failed us." Nah, nah, nah. But you did have this. Now there hasn't seemed, at least yet, to be any backlash against this. There were, of course, the fears that they're going to go into an uprising sort of mode over this kid getting acquitted. And I think the worst, you said there were some protests in Chicago. And as you were saying, it's very hard to get the Black Lives Matter crowd out, especially in the middle
Yeah.
of late fall, encroaching on winter,
Early winter.
in a place in the upper Midwest, in a town of about 100,000 people. That is mostly white. That is, again, sort of has that small Midwestern city feel to it. And being
You're right. And for two white guys.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
For two white, actually two white passing and one white guy. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, but
yeah, if you want to go into detail on a granular level.
yeah,
let's
yeah.
say.
But like I said, white. Like again, as far as the public mind is concerned, three white guys who uh, took around, two of which did not make it, and one of which who really, you could say, in a way, won the case for Kyle. Now, again, I'm no lawyer, but I don't know, just his admission that he initiated that confrontation. Like that's when I was starting to think like, oh yeah, they got him. But again, the kid got off, and really, it shows. It shows a threat into the system insofar as people were willing to draw the line in their communities, and despite again what the press might say, Kenosha was by extension his community. He lived, 21 miles away from there. He was like 25 minutes out, as opposed to Groyskowitz, who the one survivor, who was from 50 miles out. But you know what, Groyskowitz at least he didn't cross state lines. But again, you had this kid who had a lot of family there. His father lived there. He had grandparents there, aunts and uncles, etc. So, and I believe he even worked there. But again, and as somebody who has to drive a lot, as somebody who is a ruralite, driving half an hour to go somewhere just on a routine, it's like you're practically local at that point, with as familiar as you are with the surroundings. And again, but the point I'm trying to make about all of that, dispelling the notions of him just being this, crazed man from out of town who did X, Y, and Z, it shows that you know what? People might not be willing to do X, Y, or Z. People might not be willing to take whatever dumb political action. But when you bring this kind of crap to their backyard, especially to, again, like a small Midwestern city that did, just to point out, go for Trump last election cycle. Not that, again, not that Trump is great, not trying to make any point about Trump, but just showing the uh, political instincts and leanings of the people in that community. When you bring that kind of stuff to their backyard, it's inevitable you'll provoke this response, especially when the authorities refuse to take any action of their own about this. And again, like liberals will freak out, like, "Oh, well, this sets a precedent." Yeah, a precedent for legal and justified self-defense, I suppose. But I suppose that's the worst thing ever. You have the ACLU talking about how this is such a failure of justice again. Not to not to revert to my libertarian days, but this organization is supposed to be about civil liberties. Apparently, third trimester abortions, that's a civil liberty. Being sexually deviant around children in a public sphere, that's a civil liberty. Using legal force to defend yourself, even if it does cost somebody else their life, that is not a civil liberty. That is not something we'll defend. But I suppose with the roots of the ACLU, we could go on all day about that. It it's fitting for them. Let's just put it that way. And at the end of the day, again, I think it showed a few things. Number one, what a local can do for their community when they act within their legal rights, that I would say, at least in a mythological sense, are guaranteed by what's left of the Constitution. Again, even as much as I think the Constitution is just a piece of paper at this point, as worthless as the document has been for the past century at least. We can go even further than that if you want to. And as much as I don't even like as many of the liberal presuppositions of the foundation of the American government, all of that aside, people exercising the rights that were at least on their face sold to them, even after a certain point, it becomes hard for any amount of rigging or any amount of court nonsense to get you out, get you on a cut and dry case like this when he clearly acted within his rights. But point being, it shows with when people in their local communities stand up for their local communities. And again, I'm not advocating you do anything, but I'm just saying when you act within your legal rights to defend yourself from a threat, and whether that's lethal or not, again, I could put all these qualifiers out there all day, but please spare me, YouTube overlords. I'm trying to keep this show on the air on our primary platform here. I still haven't diversified yet, but I've put out enough qualifiers where if they get me, that's on them, and I hold no responsibility for this. But it shows when people are willing to, let's just say, stand up for themselves, that a lot of this stuff isn't tolerated. And I brought this up last week. You could make the argument that when this happened in Kenosha, the rioting didn't completely stop, but it did burn out to a large degree across the country. They were afraid of other places happening with this. And again, this was also Wisconsin, which, is by all means a purple state. Sure, they do have a Democratic government, but they also are a rural upper Midwestern state where a lot of people are, you know, sport shooters, a lot of people are hunters, a lot of people carry around guns, and I'm pretty sure that Wisconsin has one of the better carrying laws in the country. But so there was really nothing they could get him on, and within the circumstance that they acted, it shows that yeah, you can stand up to this behemoth just by doing what you do in your local community. It doesn't even have to be violence, so to speak. As detestable as the people were, it's still like it still takes a toll on you to, of course, take somebody's life. And you could tell by Kyle's conduct within the trial, especially when he was giving you that own accounts of events. It's not like anyone really wants to come to that. And again, they were trying to paint him like this, crazed, bloodthirsty maniac who was just out for, again, who had this, dangerous, fully semi-auto assault rifle, just using media terms there, yet only, racked up, three casualties. Like, something doesn't add up there when it comes to, bloodthirsty maniac out on the loose. But, with all that being said, it is a win. I would say the kind of energy I felt today from the system, their reaction to it, is on par with the 2016 Trump victory.
Yes.
And I would say, while, again, this case, in theory, may just be an open and shut self defense case, whatever, the reaction to it, the reaction that somebody would actually stand up to their community and actually say, we're not going to tolerate this being imposed on us, it has sent the empire into yet another tailspin. Like I said, we haven't seen since before Trump was president, since when Trump was running for office and actually elected, and I think it's probably the best thing to come out of it. Similar to the Youngkin victory in Virginia with the gubernatorial election. Despite whatever comes after this, the symbology of this matters so much more than anything else that has happened.
Absolutely. You know, and I guess the word that pops into my head when I think about this event is how clean it was. Uh, with Trump, one could argue that that was, and successfully argue that that was a steam-letting event, right? They know how unhappy half of America was. They know how much they wanted change. They know how disappointed they were. They knew how they were becoming targeted. And, you could argue that, considering, the campaign manager Finkelstein and his background and everything and Trump's background, that this was a valve steam letting event, right? And now it shocked the system. And I would say more than half the system was not prepared for this. They acted quickly, even though it didn't look like they had any contingency plans. This is why I think they focused so much on the dossier. The dossier was already always there to discredit Trump. Um, but even going to that extent meant that Hillary's campaign people were probably already worried that Trump was going to be a serious contender. Because of course the initial report says they were just like laughing at the idea of Trump, becoming president. In many ways, basically not being in the here and now. Like, no, those Americans wouldn't have voted for Trump in 2012 or 2008 and so on, but they sure as hell were going to do it in 2016. So I think the reason the dossier was made such a big deal of is because it didn't really have a contingency plan, right? Unless you're talking about Finkelstein and the guys who were close to the campaign and always understood that once Trump was elected, he would achieve a few things and then he would be whisked away. But I think rightly, those of the elites who were not prepared for this, and this is a case of the inner party never trusting the outer party because it considers it to be more perforated, more porous. Um, I think this is why they made such a hill out of this mole, uh, simply because they had nothing to work with. But they quickly rebounded. They're very smart. We've always maintained that. And that's one kind of event. This is a very clear-cut event. America had already gone through 3 months of looting and arson and killings and so on. We saw all kinds of things. We saw protesters getting in the way of cars driving over them. We saw protesters in vans or SUVs driving over cops in Buffalo. We saw people pulled out of their cars and beaten up. I saw one guy with a hammer,
And you want to talk about
knocking.
like that like I mean that goes all the way back to the day after Trump when we saw incidents like that.
Right, 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 right. But this was so sustained and on such another level. And so this was very clean and cut in the same way that the plethora of video evidence it made it very clear cut. I think uh, any prosecution would have had a very difficult time trying to convince people of what happened. And that's because there's no video evidence for it. I mean, the prosecution even said that Kyle ran after Rosenbaum when it was the reverse. And you have to understand when you're the jury and you see the evidence, you know that the prosecution is up to something. You know they're being dishonest. And this was a unanimous decision that should be noted, even though there were 6 women on jury duty. Um, so I would say this is very clean. What it represents symbolically is very important. It does give white people in the West the feeling that they have a right to protect themselves. Now, it's in some ways this because this was so clear cut. There are going to be instances, and in fact, there were instances where there was no video evidence, where it wasn't clear cut, and people in Kyle Rittenhouse's position, killed themselves.
Yeah, going back to Jake Gardner of, I believe it was Colorado, where he was put in the same position. His property was surrounded by rioters, by looters, and he used force against them. And of course, he was charged. And rather than being drugged through that system, he decided death was a preferable alternative. And you also had the one case, I can't remember the name of, a man in Texas who found himself in a much similar position, who is now being dragged through the system for using lethal force to defend himself. And again, there were incidents all across the country where this sort of thing happened or almost happened, where there were armed standoffs where something like this could have happened. And with that being said, some of the reactions to this, we've already covered the regular shrieking, but you also do have people who are like, oh, well, Kyle didn't do anything wrong. He defended himself, but X, Y, and Z, and here's why it was wrong. Here's why he shouldn't have been there. And, I think the biggest lesson we can learn from Kyle Rittenhouse are two things, is being a hero isn't worth it, and no good deed goes unpunished. Now, that being said, I don't think he was foolish or reckless at all. Like, you could say he was naive. I think that's probably the worst thing you could, the worst attribute you could give to him, that he trusted in the system too much. I mean, this was your typical Midwestern kid, like, oh, I want to be a cop when I grow up. I want to serve my community. Coming from these like rural middle America values, this guy who still, again, you can't really fault him because he's 17 at this point, who still has faith in the system and society that, oh yeah, things will just work if we abide by the rules, blah 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 blah. And you know what, sometimes we have to stand up to ourselves, so long as we, again, just sort of this, you could say, aggregate of middle America. I would say Kyle Rittenhouse, which is funny given his partially Hispanic background. People were raking him over the coals for that. But point being
Yeah, you
is,
know who else had a Hispanic background?
oy vey, who's that?
Zimmerman.
Oh no, not that again.
Well, not just Hispanic, but
Oh boy. But just going from that, I would say number one, it shows that, yeah, being a hero isn't worth it. I think what he did was in the right. I don't think he was stupid for wanting to defend what was, more or less a second home to him, if not a primary home. Like I said, he had several family members live there. He worked there. Again, he probably knew the place like the back of his hand. And with that also being said, no good deed goes unpunished. That, he stands up, he does, and what the courts have now decided was ostensibly the right thing, and he still gets drugged through this process. He still gets, slandered, and you could even say libel at the way the media treated him, and going up to somebody who was, a contender for the presidency at the time, Joe Biden. He said these things about Kyle as well, and we were talking off air. It's like, if it were me, if it were somebody I knew, I would say avoid that like the plague. Stay out of there. It's not worth it. It's not worth yourself. It's not worth your life. But I'm not going to write him off as foolish or stupid for what he did. Like I said, the worst attribute I will give Kyle is that he was naive, which is to be expected of a 17-year-old who grew up in Middle America.
right. And I think there is an ironic side to this. It very well may be the thing that at least for a while, or maybe in a limited way, turns things around. This is really important, and it's important for a lot of people. This decision that came down. Yes, it will divide the country more, but we're accelerationists, and moreover, is like I was alluding earlier. This is not a pressure. Like, nobody told those jurors you're going to find him innocent of everything, because white people are getting uppity, and they need to be told that things are going to be
In
okay.
fact, the pressure was the exact opposite.
Yes, exactly. Make no mistake, the elites wanted for Rittenhouse exactly what Chauvin got, or worse, or worse. And they didn't care that he was 17 when that happened. They don't care about the circumstances. They don't care that every time he was being pursued, that this happened. They don't. They just don't care. That just simply doesn't matter.
Yeah,
So
and it does
this
make
is
me
very
fear that, again, with this guy in Texas and with some of these other cases floating around, that they will be made an example of in light of their failure here.
right, right. So it is actually really important. It doesn't, of course, nowhere nearly ends the fight. I mean, this is some much needed good news in what has been a desert of bad news for a very, very long time, for years, really. And a lot of people were relieved. I had friends of mine who said they cried when they got the news. They were so happy, the kind of relief from it. I mean, even I got teary, couldn't believe it. But I think we're all wiser. Um, so it's not like who was it, the Virginia governor that just recently got
Youngkin.
elected? Uh, Anyhow, uh, he like I think we all knew that he's a compromise. He's he's an Israeli firster. He's a vaccine mandate guy, or he's not going to help out the people. But he's the lesser of two evils, and I know that's not a path to victory. I get it, but again, it is not what the system wants. The system is very upset by it. I don't think they're just acting. Definitely with the outcome of the Rittenhouse case, they are not acting. This is and so far we haven't seen any massive protests. I'm hearing that there's a protest happening in Brooklyn. Not much happening in Chicago, save 30, 40 people, all of them white, marching in downtown Chicago with little placards in the bicycle lane. Um, we shall see.
Well,
Um,
just when I thought there couldn't be anything more insufferable in the cyclist lane.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah, but
so
nothing in
yeah.
Kenosha proper so far. Like, you had some um, belligerents outside the courthouse, but that was mostly dispelled.
Mhm.
Um, and it's
The crazy woman who threw herself into it looked like an epileptic seizure. She was just, I
Oh
am a
yeah, yeah.
monument.
That
I
one
am a monument.
protester who was like, again, I'm not sure whether like something actually happened or whether it was just like, or just like a tantrum.
No,
But like, I heard somebody call it demonic possession. I was like, it's kind of
yeah.
it kind of
I
kind of
thought it
looks
was
like
like
that.
I thought it was like one of the most American things I've ever seen. Like,
Yeah, like the kind of reaction to this is, again, it's very reminiscent of like inauguration day 2017, or
yeah,
the day after the
yes,
election
yes.
in 2016. Like the absolute vitriol and like the really seething going around it. Again, nothing really compares in recent history except the election of Trump. And again, like I said, this has gone well for us. I frankly do believe that justice has prevailed today, but I fear for the next guy. Really, I really do. I don't think he will be extended the same courtesy because they don't want two of these people in a row. Not by any
Hmm,
means.
hmm, hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is after 3 months of rioting, I think the left got this idea that there's a sacred right to riot, um, that supersedes everything else. Because again, they have a big idea about justice. It's justice with a capital J, and all these other little laws. They're just colonial racist laws that are getting in the way of enacting a new era of justice. And so 3 months of this was going on. That's the context in which this belongs. This isn't like, people were having a picnic, then this guy showed up. No, that's not the case at all. So people were getting fed up. And the tragedy of this, I explained the irony, but the tragedy, if we're going to talk about it, this young man who did this, I mean, he's a kid. He's not even a man in some states and in some countries for that matter. Um, is that it took him, like this 17-year-old, like that's that kind of really shows you what kind of trouble we're in. Now, over and above that, the cops should have been doing their job and they didn't, because
Oh,
of course,
one of the officers testified that like, oh yeah, I saw the thing unfolded when the kid tried to turn himself in. I told him to get out of here, like, and like he wasn't like remorseful about this or anything. He wasn't like apologetic. He was just like, oh yeah, he said, oh I did this, and I yelled at him to get out of here. So, when he tries to voluntarily surrender, like the cop who watched it on all of it unfold, that was the reaction. And again,
yeah,
I've been saying the more the authorities refuse to do their job, the more of these kind of incidences you will have, especially if politics, especially in election years, follows the same trajectory it has been for the past several years. This will not be the end of this. It's only a matter of time before some political stunt is needed, and the next big victim of police brutality or whatever is the front page of national news again, and we get more instances of this. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be in an election year, because you can tell, like with Ferguson, which was really the one that started all of this, and at least in the contemporary sense, I suppose you could point to the Zimmerman debacle if you want to go back that far. But Ferguson was in 2014, which the most significant thing you could point to were congressional elections, which the Republicans won. And again, so it certainly is tied to election years, but not as much as some people would have you believe.
hmm
And again, we have certainly not seen the end of this, and we will certainly not see the end of this for quite some time. And what the end of this looks like, I couldn't even hazard a guess.
yeah.
But that's all I had, unless you have any additional items.
I don't. I just think the irony, that we wouldn't want if we had sons, we wouldn't want them to do this, and yet like we wouldn't we wouldn't want to change anything after this outcome. And that's hopeful and deeply sad at the same time.
Like I said, well, all I can leave with you with is, he almost certainly is a hero, but when it comes to weighing your own personal decisions, in my opinion, being a hero isn't really worth it.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what kind of life he's going to have, right? He's going to be a marked man, obviously,
Oh,
right?
certainly.
But yeah, I mean, in many ways, this saga is not over. So we'll see uh, if we experience any of the looting and demonstrations that we saw last year. If they happen now. It's Friday night. Again, I'm seeing some stuff from Chicago taking place, some looting, but I mean, looting has never stopped on a grand scale since the end of the riots, anyways. So,
Almost certainly not.
uh, yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report. There was quite a bit to cover, but it was still somehow shorter than some of our last few episodes. So, thank you everyone for tuning in to this very pivotal episode, so to speak, and we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
And take care.